One of the things that I like to do from time to time is start off with a game. Are you guys up for playing a game with me? All right. So this is a game that we're calling Fill in the Gap, okay? What's best in the gap? Now, that sounds a little weird. There's going to be some images on the screen, though, and those images are going to reveal a gap, and you get to choose from two options what is best to fill in that gap. Still sounds a little weird, so let's just get to those pictures. It'll start to make a little bit more sense. You got two cookies here. What is the best choice when it comes to filling in the gap between those two cookies? Okay, two options would be ice cream or frosting. Okay, how many of you guys are going to go with ice cream? Anyone? Ice cream? Okay, a few of you. How many would say frosting? Okay, it's about half and half. How many of you are like, that's gross, that's disgusting, that's way too much sugar, I don't want to have to do any of those two choices? Anyone? Okay, you guys can go ahead and just leave now. You can't be a part of our church. We can't be friends because I have a problem. I want both. Like, let's just add it all together, right? That's me. All right, some of you may be more savory people, so we've got an option for you. All right, the gap would be, let's see, a hamburger bun, right? What are the two choices? Let's see, the two choices. You can fill that gap with either chicken or the traditional beef. Now, how many of you guys, you're about the Chick-fil-A, that's how you'd fill the gap? How many, you're going to go the traditional burger route? Yeah, as much as I like Chick-fil-A, classic hamburger. I mean, you can't be an American without that. All right, this is one for the students. Let's see that next one. If you guys can still remember when you were a student, you can play along too. Okay, the gap between classes, right? You got maybe 5-8 minutes to get to the next class. You've got two choices. What are the two choices? Typically, the choice is I'm going to use the restroom or I'm going to talk with friends. All right, how are you going to fill in the gap? How many of you say, I'm going to use the restroom? I know my bladder, it's too small. I'm going to use the restroom. How many of you guys, I'm going to talk with friends? Josh said both. He's going to be that weirdo standing at the urinal talking it up with his buddy and this is like, leave me alone, leave me alone. All right, so yeah, there's let's move on to the next one. Okay, the gap between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Okay, what are you going to do with that gap? There are a couple options. Well, you can tell people all the things that you want for Christmas, or you can start buying gifts for all those people that need gifts. How many of you are the gift buyer? How many of you just want to drop the hints? Anyone? Yeah, some of you. I like that Tony was honest. Like, yeah, Suzanne, she does all the gift buying. I just drop the hints. That's good. All right, we got one more. This is the gap between the first date and the second date. I know it's been a while for some of you, but what's the best thing to do between that gap, between the first and the second date? Well, are you going to play it cool, send a few texts, or are you going to go ahead and start planning your future wedding? Let's not even ask. I'm just going to tell you what the correct answer is. Play it cool, just send a few texts. Don't be that weirdo who's planning out a future wedding. All right, now, hopefully you guys had fun with this game. Some of you maybe wondered, why are we playing this game? Today we're going to be talking about gaps. We're going to talk specifically about gaps in relationship because in every relationship there are gaps. Now gaps come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes it's the gap between classroom breaks. Sometimes the gap is between two hamburger buns. But there are gaps relationally. What do I mean by gaps relationally? I'm talking about the gap between what someone said they're going to do and what you're pretty sure they're actually going to end up doing. Right? The gap between their really good behavior one day and their really bad behavior the next day. I'm talking about the gap between, this future hope and this dream and a past that you definitely don't want to repeat, but it might be another nightmare, right? What do you do in the gap? Well, in our series that we've been in for multiple weeks now called Work in Progress, we've been talking through what Jesus says you need to place in any gap. Relationally, if there is a gap, Jesus says, I've got a command, I've got a mandate for you. And if you live out this command, if you fill in the gaps relationally with this command, you're going to have great relationships. And so we explored what Jesus' command was, week 1. What was it? He said, this is what I want you to do. I want you to love each other as I have loved you. In week 1, we started asking the question, well, what does it actually look like? What does it look like that Jesus loved us? Because if we're going to love other people the way Jesus loved us, well, we need to know exactly how he loved us. Well, again, week 1, we talked about how we all have that invisible box of hopes, dreams, and desires we walk around with. We have hopes, dreams, desires for how many children we are going to have, how much money we're going to make, what people are going to say, and how they're going to treat us. And we take that invisible box into every single relationship we enter, and we say, okay, here you go. Now that we're in a relationship, you get to meet my hopes, dreams, and desires. And we have this idea almost of, okay, now you owe me. But Jesus says, that's not it. You need to live the way I lived. See, I didn't owe you anything, but I was willing to give you everything. And so in our relationships, we're going to have great relationships. We've got to love the way Christ has loved us. And how did Jesus love? Well, we need to have that same perspective of, you don't owe me anything, but I'm willing to give you everything. Week 2, we allowed the Apostle Paul to take us a little bit further in relationships. He looks specifically at marriage relationships and how they need to become a submission competition, leveraging all their gifts, talents, abilities, resources to the benefit of the other. And the other person needs to do the same. And then we opened up, and you guys can do this again today, to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, a section of Scripture that we know of as the what chapter? The love chapter. And we have not gotten finished with the love chapter. Week 1, we started in, or I should say week 3, week 1 of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, though. We started in verse 4. And again, how are we supposed to fill in those gaps relationally? Well, we're supposed to have patience. We're supposed to fill in the gap with kindness rather than envy, rather than boasting, rather than pride. How are we supposed to fill in the gap? We're supposed to honor the other person. Instead of filling the gap with selfishness, we're supposed to fill in the gap with selflessness. We're supposed to be people who actually aren't quickly angered. Instead, what do? We make sure to actually hear their story instead of just demanding them to listen to our story. Now, this week, we're going to continue, and we're going to start in verse 6. So if you haven't opened your Bibles, go ahead and do that. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, starting in verse 6. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. All right, so this one kind of makes sense, right? If you're really loving somebody, you're not going to get really excited about evil, sinful, wicked things. Instead, you're going to focus on what is true, what is right, what is admirable, right? Paul talks about that later in Philippians. Now, we're going to get back to verse 6, but what I want to do is actually tackle verse 7. We'll come back to verse 6, but verse 7 is kind of the grand finale. This is that walk-off home run in the 9th inning. This is where the crowd goes wild because it just kind of hits it hard. This is what love is. So let's get to verse 7. He says, love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. What does love do? Love always protects. Love always trusts. Love always hopes. Love always perseveres. And the crowd goes wild, and everyone gets really excited. Grand finale, right? We won the game. Let's go love people really, really well. But let's go a little bit deeper with this. You know, whenever we read Scripture, it's one of those things that sometimes you read it, and it's like, okay, that's nice. But then when you get into it, it becomes a little bit more challenging. In fact, throughout this whole series, it's been, for me at least, even that first command, love each other as Christ has loved me, that's made me squirm a little bit. I don't know if it's made you squirm a little bit, but it has for me, certainly. Because I know, oh man, Jesus, he's loved me in some pretty miraculous ways. But then when I really get in the details, it's like, I don't even know if some of this is even possible. So let's go to that next slide. Yeah, that's good. So we've got this list of things that love always does. So just think through this. So love always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. There's one on this list that I think stands out as being particularly difficult. Maybe it's just me, but I think there's one that stands out where when I think about it, always? Really? Always? Maybe that's not even very wise for us to do. Which one do you think stands out as just being particularly difficult? Trust, right? It's always trusts. You know, always protects. I think we can, even if the other person's in the wrong, I think most of us, we can still protect the relationship. You know, there's a bus bearing down on somebody. You don't really like them, but you don't want them dead. So you're like, okay, hey, I'm going to protect you. Get out of the way. The bus is going to kill you, right? Always hopes. We naturally have this desire for the future to be better. So yeah, it's not good now, but I hope it's going to get better. Always, perseveres. We understand that there's ups and there's downs relationally, and so, okay, I'm going to persevere through this difficult time. But trust, always trust. In the original Greek, that word trust is actually the word believe. And some of your translations actually might read that way. That believes, love believes all things. Really? So our default as people needs to be to believe, to trust all things, all the time, in every situation. That's what love does. Is that even practical? Doesn't that open you up to all kinds of possible abuse? Is that naive to think that we can always do that? What's interesting is research is coming out that is explaining that we have actually this natural tendency to trust people. There's a researcher, he's actually a professor at Stanford University. His name is Roderick Kramer, and he has this to say about trust. He says, humans are born highly dependent on caretakers. Because of this need, we enter the world hardwired to make social connections. Within 1 hour of birth, a human infant will draw her head back to look into the eyes and face of the person gazing at her. Within a few more hours, the infant will orient her head in the direction of her mother's voice. In short, we're social beings from the get-go. We're born to be engaged and to engage others, which is what trust is largely about, at least according to Kramer. And then Kramer goes on and he cites all these different research projects to support how even these mild little cues will trigger trust in us towards other people. He mentioned one research project where small groups were gathered together and they were told about an activity that they were going to have to compete against each other. And if the instructor, if the one who was explaining the rules went over and gently touched one of the other participants, maybe a gentle touch on the back, maybe a touch on the shoulder, the person that they touched was far less likely to compete against the instructor once the activity began. What was that? Well, it was this little subtle cue of, you can trust me. Just a little gentle touch can actually trigger us trusting people. There was another research project that he cited that we actually have a natural tendency to trust people who look more like us. So today, if you are a middle-aged, balding white guy, hey, you're in luck. I'm going to trust you more naturally than, let's say, you ladies who are in your 70s and you've got a full head of hair, right? According to the research, that's what it says. Another study showed that if you're a part of the same social kind of networking, you have a natural tendency to trust those people more. Example of this would be you're in the same church, but you've never actually talked to each other. You've seen each other, but you don't know anything about each other's character. You don't know anything about their work ethic. You don't know anything about them. But if you see them out in town, because they were in your church, you are naturally more trusting of that person. So all the research seems to be pointing to the fact that actually living this out, always trusting, always believing all things, it's not actually hard. But isn't it? Isn't it actually really difficult? It's one thing to trust somebody on the front end because of a gentle touch, but once that trust has been broken, once someone has actually done something to harm us, continuing day in, day out, always trusting them, doesn't it become just exponentially more difficult? Let me try to illustrate this in a kind of a silly way. How many of you you've ever done a trust fall before? It's that camp experience. You do one of these things, they fall back and they catch you. Any of you guys? Okay, a few of you. Get a load of this video.
All right, so it's called a trust fall. So eyes have to be closed, okay? And when I say go, so I'm going to count and say go, then you have to fall and Daisy will catch you, okay?
Mhm.
It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
All right. 1, 2, 3, go. You meant to fall backwards. It's hilarious. Are you alright?
There was actually some sound. Oh, hey, there we go. Okay, sometimes it takes us a little while to get the sound. There was sound on that, but I think you got the general idea of that. It was a little funnier with the sound, but that poor girl, depending on your empathy level, like you're laughing right now, or you're just like, oh, that poor girl, right? Here's the question that I want to ask you, though. Do you think that greater trust was gained by this exercise with mom and big sister, or do you think trust might have been lost a little bit with this exercise? Probably lost, right? And why? Why was it? Because there was a gap in the relationship. There was a gap. What was the gap? The gap was between what mom said was going to happen, and you didn't hear what mom said was going to happen, but she said, hey, we're going to do this little trust fall, and you're going to actually fall, and your big sister's going to catch you, and everything's going to be great. Well, did it happen? No, it didn't happen because there was this gap. Mom said it was going to happen, and it didn't happen. So what do we do? What do we do with those gaps? As relationally, consistently, probably every single day, you will experience gaps relationally. And typically the gaps really come down to the gap between what you expected to happen, kind of like this young girl. What you expected to happen, they're going to pick me up at 6 o'clock. What you expected to happen, hey, your spouse told you they're going to stop spending so much money on the credit card. What you expected to happen, and, well, what you actually experience. Now, there are always going to be gaps. You are going to have these gaps between what you expected and what you actually experience. And it's your choice. It's my choice what we actually place in this gap. So we can have this experience where someone told you that they were going to pick you up at 6 o'clock, but it's now 6:15. Well, what are you going to place in that gap? Well, great relationships realize that you're going to place this in the gap, that you are going to continue to believe the best. Yeah, I know, they said 6. It's now 6:15. What are you going to do? Are you going to choose to believe the best? Okay, maybe work is going a little bit late. Maybe they hit traffic. Heaven forbid they got in an accident, but man, I'm sure they're trying to be here. I'm going to continue to believe the best. Okay, we got the credit card statement. They told me they weren't going to spend as much money on the credit card, but I'm looking at the statement, and somebody, it appears, actually spent $150 at the Bass Pro Shop. Okay, I don't shop at the Bass Pro Shop, but I'm sure there's a good explanation. I don't know why they did that, but I'm going to find out before I jump to conclusions. I'm going to believe the best. Okay, Mom said she was going to make sure my big sister was going to catch me. My nose is really hurting. Everybody is laughing at me. I don't know what happened, but I know my mom loves me. I know my big sister loves me, and so I'm going to continue to believe the best. So, first choice, when there is a gap relationally, and you're going to experience all kinds of gaps relationally, the first choice that we have, and it's the best choice. And at the time, it's not going to feel like a choice. It's going to feel like emotionally it's just coming out of you. But it consistently is your choice. You can either believe the best or you can assume the worst. They did it again. I knew it. It was just a matter of time. I know they said they were going to spend money, but there it is. It's $150. I knew it. 6:15. They're always late. They can never be here on time. Big sister, mom, they're always out to get me. They're always making fun of me. I don't know if I can trust. I don't think I can trust them anymore. I'm going to assume the worst. When there's a gap relationally, we choose what we place here. Are you going to assume the worst, or are you going to believe the best? Great relationships, consistently believe the best. Over the past few weeks, my sons and I, we've been going through the Gospel of Mark. If you've ever read through the Gospel of Mark, maybe you know a little bit of the Gospel of Mark. Most people believe that the Apostle Peter gave a lot of the information to Mark that he wrote down about Jesus' life, which is interesting because if you've ever read through the Gospel of Mark, like some of the other Gospels, Peter is not always seen in the best light. In fact, there's multiple times where it's like, whoa, Peter, what were you thinking? The first one that my boys noticed, we were reading about how Peter just completely misread Jesus' ministry. And so there was this moment where Peter grabs Jesus hey, here's a little pro tip for you. Maybe you should stop telling people that you're going to suffer and die. You remember what Jesus' response to Peter was? He said, get behind me, Satan. When we read that, one of my boys said, oh, burn. And then man, if Jesus calls you Satan, oh man, you really messed up, right? The next time they noticed something was a little off with Peter was when it was on the mountain when he was being transfigured. And so all of his glory and deity is being demonstrated visually. And then we've got Moses and Elijah up there too. And Peter's geeking out about Moses and Elijah. He's like, oh yeah, we could build some tents and this is going to be really great. And then what happens? This voice from heaven says, hey, Peter, you're not getting it. Jesus is here. My son is here. That's what should have your focus. That's what you should get excited about. And again, one of my boys was like, oh man, if God has to audibly speak to you from heaven, you've messed up big time. And this is Peter. He's the one that jumps out of the boat and he starts walking on the water and he's really excited. And then what happens? Well, he gets intimidated and he begins to sink. Peter, the guy who says, you know what, absolutely. These guys, I agree with you, Jesus. They may completely abandon you, but not me. I will go down swinging. I will die for you. And then in a few short hours, like a little girl comes and says, hey, weren't you with him? And he's like, no, I wasn't with that guy. I wasn't bleepity bleep 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 with that guy. Like he calls down curses, right? This is Peter. Peter, the guy who pulls out the sword, starts hacking off ears, even though Jesus says, it's got to happen. It's going to happen. What do we see with Jesus and Peter's relationship? There were some major gaps. Do you guys catch the gaps relationally? Peter says one thing, and then he does something completely different. He's excited one moment, oh yeah, I'm all for you, and then the next moment he's running. He's got all kinds of faith one moment, and then the faith is gone the next. There's all kinds of gaps. So what does Jesus do? How does he fill in the gap? How does Jesus love Peter? Well, it would be very easy for him to assume the worst. Peter, man, you are so emotional, and your emotions are taking you in just weird. I don't know if I can trust you. You know, Peter, you're a great guy sometimes, but not all the time. And because you're not a great guy, and I don't know really exactly what to expect, I don't know if I can trust you. Does he do this? Is this how he loves Peter? No. He consistently believes the best. We see this while he's even doing ministry with Peter. He comes alongside Peter and says, okay, I know we've had some gaps, but I'm going to build my church through you. I believe the best about you, Peter. Even after he denies Jesus, Easter morning, what happens? Mary and Jesus are having this conversation. He says, hey, Mary, go back to the disciples and tell them what's going on. And tell Peter. Just tell the disciples, and then he specifically mentions, and Peter. What's going on there? I think in a sense is what he's doing is he's like, hey, Peter, I'm still believing the best in you. And then later on, what do we see? We have this interaction with Peter and Jesus at the lake, and Jesus looks at him and says, hey, I want you to feed my sheep. It's like, do you love me? Yeah, I love you, Jesus. Well, then I'm going to trust that you are going to be able to be that shepherd who actually feeds my sheep, allows them to grow in Christian maturity. I am still believing the best about you, Peter. And it's not just that Jesus loved Peter this way. Jesus loves you this way too. I mean, just think for a moment all the different ways that Jesus actually trusts you. I mean, when I think through all the different ways that God actually trusts me, it blows my mind. I mean, just think for a moment. Like, okay, so God, you trust me with this wonderful, beautiful woman to actually honor her, to respect her, to be the husband that you think I can be, and I don't know if I can actually be it. Really, you trust me with that relationship? So you're going to give me 4 children who get to see all of Dad's mistakes, all of his sinful actions, and you trust that they're not just going to become like these depraved human beings? Really? You trust me with these human lives? Okay, God, you trust me, like every single Sunday, to stand up here and take your truth, take your word, and speak from your scripture and not mess it up every single time I open my mouth? What does Jesus do? He believes the best about each and every one of us. And then he turns around and he says, okay, this is how I want you to love others in your life. Yeah, I know there's going to be gaps. There's absolutely going to be gaps. And there are going to be moments where you're going to fill that gap by assuming the worst about people. But that's not how I loved you. I have believed the best, and I want you to consistently believe the best about others. In his book, The One Thing You Need to Know, a guy by the name of Marcus Buckingham, he cites this 20-year research that was done on couples, not just here in the United States, but in Canada, in Europe, and all these other places in the world. And they did this 20-year study to explore what is it that allow not only couples to go the distance, but also to still love each other at the end of 20 plus years. They're not just, slogging through it, but somehow they're still happy with each other. And it was interesting because when they got into the research, these researchers just assumed that there would be some commonalities. And one of the things that they just assumed was that these couples, the reason why they're happy is they just set their standards really low. The thought was, you set the standards low enough and it's not hard to skip over that expectation. So as long as the husband doesn't expect the wife to just expects, hey, she's not going to spend all my money this weekend on some shopping spree. Well, then I still love her. Or, hey, as long as he's flushing the toilet and he's closing the lid, I guess we're still, like that was their thought. You set the bar low enough and anyone can just, yeah, okay, that's good. But what they found was it was almost the exact opposite. What they found is that these couples actually had this unrealistic expectation of their spouse. Let me read to you what they actually found. They found, first of all, that when they were asked questions, each couple was given this list of questions that ask or answer about their spouse, and in every single category, they rated their spouse higher than the spouse rated themselves. So again, it might have questions about their looks, and they're just like, oh yeah, so attractive. Oh, they're just so beautiful, even after all these years. Questions about their character. Oh, they're just so dependable, and their work ethic is so fantastic. So they rated their spouse, and then they had their spouse rate themselves. And in every single one of these couples, their spouse rated them better than they rated themselves. Okay, so what did the researchers find? Check this out. They explained in this research that they had this unrealistic, each one of these couples had an unrealistic positive view about their spouse. The researchers even thought to themselves, okay, is it true that maybe love is actually blind because they're not seeing their partner for who they actually are? And then they said this unrealistic positive view created an upward spiral of love. Get this. The illusion that their partner was the best created the conviction that it was actually true. This conviction led to a deeper sense of security in the relationship. What does that mean? They had deeper levels of trust, right? That's what's creating that security. That security then fostered greater intimacy. Intimacy fostered love, which then came back around and created the conviction that their spouse really was the best. You catching what's happening here? What's happening is it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. What did they do? There were gaps, I'm sure, in every single one of these marriages. But what did they fill in the gap? They believed the best. And when they chose to believe the best, that other individual, the other partner, actually lived up to the best. Jesus says, you want to love well? You want to consistently love people well? Believe the best about those people. Believe the best. You know, I think there are hurdles to this, and I'm not naive to the fact that there are some obstacles when it comes to believing the best about people. I think one of the first obstacles is, well, how can I believe the best about them when their behavior isn't the best? And consistently, they're not getting better, they're getting worse. Absolutely. We understand. There are going to be times where you're going to have to actually put up some boundaries so that you don't continue to get hurt. And we don't want to undermine that. We understand that maybe one of the obstacles is just your own past experiences. Maybe some of the baggage from previous relationships. We know some of you have gone through divorce. Some of you have multiple divorces. And there's some pain that has crept into your life because of that. And you're thinking to yourself, I don't know if I can trust another man. I don't know if I can trust another woman. I don't know if I can believe the best about maybe a whole group of people. Maybe you've got a father who was never in your life. Maybe you have a mother who was abusive. Maybe you put some trust and some belief in an authority figure, and they took complete advantage of you because of that. And so, yeah, because of that baggage, it's going to be difficult to believe the best about people. But what I want to emphasize here is you still have the choice. It is your choice what you choose to place in this gap. And what we learn is that great relationships consistently do what Jesus does. And he believed the best. And that's what we need to do as well. I think at this time it's probably important to go back to verse 6, though. Verse 6, what did it say? Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. I think there's a lot of great application and interpretation on that verse. But I think in part, what Paul's probably saying is, love doesn't get really excited when you catch people messing up. Love doesn't get really excited when you find sin and you find mistakes and you find people not doing what you expected them to do. That's not what love does. Instead, it protects from that situation. I've said it before. I'll probably keep saying it. We find what we are looking for. If you're looking for something, you're going to eventually find it. And Scripture is really, really clear about the heart and the life of human beings. What does it say? It says that all have sinned and all have fallen short of God's glory. So if you look close enough and you try to find sin and mistakes and failures, guess what? You are going to see them. You are going to find them. Is that what love does? No. Verse 7 explains what love actually does. Love always protects. Part of that protection is protecting against suspicion, protecting against jumping to the worst conclusion, protecting the relationship from having these overreactions. You can fill the gap with overreaction. You can fill the gap with all kinds of suspicion. You can do that. But that's not what love does. Instead, it protects from that. Love always hopes. Like, love goes positive. Love doesn't go negative. You know what negative does? It assumes the worst. That's not hopeful. You want to assume the best about people. That's what love does. And I love the wording here. Love always perseveres. I love this word because I think as you read this and as you start to squirm and say, I don't even know. I don't even know if that's actually the best way to live my life. Understand, this word, persevere, it implies that this is not going to be an easy thing to do. It implies that it's going to be a struggle. It implies that it's going to be difficult for you emotionally to say, okay, I'm going to believe the best, even though it's really, really hard. Now understand, there's going to become a point where you're going to believe the best until you can no longer believe it anymore. But you're still not going to assume the worst. You're going to set up boundaries? Absolutely. But what do we see? It perseveres. And if you continue to persevere most of the time, just like those couples see, that there will be a blessing on the other end of that perseverance. And let's just be real honest. What are the alternatives that we have? The alternative we have is, well, let's live in a relationship where we create a lot of suspicion, where we're always thinking the worst, where we're always jumping to the worst conclusion, where we're just overreacting. Like, is that really a great option for great relationships? No. I want you to imagine that you are sitting across from a young woman, a young man, and they've come to you and they've said, hey, you know what, I'm thinking about marrying this girl. I'm thinking about saying yes to this guy's proposal. What would you suggest will really make a great relationship? What are you going to say to them? You're going to say, well, you know what, I would suggest laying a trap, right? And eventually, like, they'll put their foot in that trap. And then you get to yank that thing back and go, aha! I mean, is that the advice that you're going to give? Hey, just start assuming the worst. It's going to work. You'll have a great... No, you're not going to say that. You're going to say, you know what? There are gaps that take place in all of our relationships. Every single one of us, we're going to have this expectation. And they're not going to necessarily meet our expectation. And in that moment, it's going to be really easy to assume the worst. But I would recommend that you take a step back and you just try to figure out the best explanation. In fact, that research that I told you about earlier, this research, they said, hey, this is really great research for those couples, right? This upward spiral of love. But what about the rest of us? How does this relate to you and I? How can we take what they learned in their relationships and apply it to ours? And here's what the researchers suggested. They said, find the most generous explanation for each other's behavior and believe it. You guys catch that? Find the most generous explanation for why they're doing what they're doing and choose to believe it. That's exactly what we're seeing Paul talking about. There's a gap. Okay, what is the most generous explanation for why they're doing what they're doing? Or why they didn't do what they said they were going to do? What is the most generous explanation? I'm going to choose to believe it. Here's the challenge this week. What I want you to do is I want you to live this out. What I want you to do is as you go through this week and you experience gaps, what I want you to do is just ask yourself, okay, what is the most generous explanation for why they did what they do? And I'm going to believe that. So you're driving tomorrow and someone cuts you off on the highway. Your first reaction might be, oh, what a jerk. Can't believe that guy. Oh, man, people around here, they're just the worst, right? That might be your first reaction. But take a step back and say, okay, I'm going to come up with the most generous explanation possible, and I'm going to choose to believe it. Okay, maybe they're late for work. And if they're late one more time for work, they're actually in jeopardy of being fired. And that's why they're driving so quick, and I get it. That would cause a lot of stress in my life too. So I'm going to give that guy a pass. Maybe they're rushing to the hospital because somebody they know and love is, in some sort of danger. Maybe they've just drank a lot of coffee and they need to get to the restroom. I've been there before. Okay, that makes sense. Come up with the most generous explanation for the gap that you are experiencing and choose to believe it. Maybe someone makes a joke at your expense. Right? What rises up in you when someone makes a joke at your expense? You start assuming the worst. What a punk. I can't believe he said that. well, I don't know if I can ever be a friend with someone who talks to me like that. Oh, I'm going to assume the worst. Or are you going to take a step back and come up with the most generous explanation for why they're doing what they're doing? You know what? I like to be liked. And I realize that sometimes in order to be liked, I make jokes. And sometimes I've made jokes at other people's expenses. But I've never actually done that to be hurtful. I've never really thought anything ill of them. I just wanted to be funny. Maybe that's what's happening here. And maybe they don't actually hate me. Maybe they don't want to hurt me. I'm going to think the most generous explanation. You're going to have gaps relationally with your spouse this week. You're going to have gaps relationally with your roommates. You're going to have gaps relationally with your friends at school. There are going to be gaps. You choose what you place to put in here. My challenge this week is every single time you get a chance to fill in the gap this week, come up with the most generous explanation for what's going on and choose to believe it. And then on top of that, guys, what I want you to do is I want you to examine your heart. What's going on in your heart when you choose to live this way? Do you find yourself just naturally loving that person a little bit more? And my guess is not only are you going to start viewing them differently, but because you start viewing them differently, it actually is going to create a different environment in your relationship. And it's going to actually change the texture of how you interact. And maybe, just maybe, you're going to start living out that same great relationship that we talked about in that study. That you're going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you actually believe the best in people, they actually begin to live their best. Because we've all been on the other end of it, haven't we? We've all been on the other end where we said something, we did something, we forgot to do something, we forgot to say something, and then a few weeks down the road, you heard how they interpreted it, and you heard that they thought this is what you actually said, and this was actually what you meant, and you're looking at it, you're like, okay, I kind of get that. Like, I kind of see how they thought that, but the only reason they thought that is because they were assuming the worst about me. And that's not at all what I meant, and that's not all what I was trying to do. And my gosh, if they had just believed the best about me, we could avoid this heartache and this headache. You ever been there before? It's the worst. That's not fun. And so as a church, as people, I want to ask you, do you want to have a great relationship? Great relationship with your wife, great relationship with your husband, great relationship with your kids, great relationship with your neighbors, great relationship with your church family. Be really intentional about what you place in the gap. Let's believe the best. Let's pray. Father, every single week in this series, I've been challenged and I've been encouraged by how you have loved me. Father, the fact that you continue to hope the best for me. The fact that you continue to persevere even in the midst of sin and mistakes. The fact that you are a God who is full of truth and there is no wrong and there is no wickedness in you. The fact that you protect me and the fact that you believe in me, that you trust me. Father, it's overwhelming, but at the same time, it is so good. And so, Father, I pray for our church. I pray that we become a church who loves the way that you have loved us, and that we'll live it out this week, and that it'll just become part of the rhythm and the pattern of our life. It won't become something that we have to even think about. We just naturally love because you have filled us with so much love. I pray this in your Son, Jesus' name.